I am so excited, especially if you've got grandkids or you've got kids in the home. This is just such an exciting next couple of days. I like Christmas as an adult even more than I liked it as a kid, and I liked it. And my parents never got me anything I asked for, and I still liked it. And so anyway, this is just an exciting time to make the most of it. If you're here today and maybe you're new or you've just been coming back this holiday season and you have a background, and I talk to people in the hallways, I get to know a lot of people that attend here at LifeBridge, and I know that this is a story that is very similar for many people out there, that you're in a place where you have some background in church. Maybe you were raised in church. Maybe your friend took you to youth group when you're a certain age. You have some background there, but when you became an adult and it was kind of time for you to make decisions, it just ended up on the back burner. It's such a common story. It ended up on the back burner, and even though you didn't God's doesn't exist, He's not important, you never went that far. But you did just put it on the back burner, and you're at a place right now where you're here, and it's important to you still, but you don't know what to do with that. And so what I want to do is just very simply invite you this Christmas season, today, maybe if you come tomorrow, just as we're getting ready for the new year, I just want to invite you to re-engage. Sometimes we think, hey, I want to get back to where I was, and this is just a general rule of thumb. Going backwards is not a very good thing. Getting back to where you were isn't necessary, but just to re-engage where you are right now. And maybe you've made mistakes, or maybe you haven't really made mistakes, but you just haven't put God as the priority. Your Heavenly Father is just like, hey, just come back and re-engage. And I could describe that a bunch of different ways. You know, that could be going to church, man. Just make church a priority and learn and worship every week and grow in that way. Or, I could say, hey, open up a gospel and read through one of the gospels. Those are both great ways to engage or re-engage. But I could put it really simply, too. It can be as simple as this. Just pray a very simple prayer. If you don't know where to start, just pray this. God, would you show me who you are? It doesn't have to be any deeper. It doesn't have to be eloquent words. You don't have to say thee and thy or anything like that. Just, God, could you show me who you are? Now, if you're like, God, I want you to prove yourself to me. If you're really God, then this person will burst into flames, right? Like that. God's not big into being tested, right? He's not going to do that. But if you sincerely want to know Him, He will answer that prayer. So I just invite you to re-engage this Christmas season as we head into the new year. And as a way to kind of encourage that and give you a reason for that, I want to talk about somebody that I don't know about you, but I identify with in the Christmas story probably more than anybody else. I don't really identify with Mary. I've never been pregnant, and I've never really been pregnant by God. There's a lot about Mary I don't identify with. Joseph, I kind of get Joseph, but there's not really a lot there, who you identify with. Baby Jesus, no. And not you either, okay? None of us should identify there. But there is one person in the Christmas story, like, I get. And not necessarily in a positive way. And especially if you're a man in here, I think you probably get him too. The person in the story I identify with is King Herod, right? You're like, well, we're at the wrong church then, if you know anything about King Herod. The thing is, the information we know about King Herod in the Gospels is actually just a snippet of what the bigger picture is of what we know about King Herod. We have a lot of writings from Roman history and from Jewish history. A guy named by Josephus tells us a lot about King Herod, and he is associated with some other names you might recognize. A couple of those are Mark Antony, who we know him, right? He had a famous girlfriend or mistress, and her name was Cleopatra. Yeah, somebody over here knew it. Good. Mark Antony. And then Octavian, and he becomes the first Caesar Augustus. He is the first emperor of Rome. And we actually know quite a bit about King Herod's interaction with these two guys. If you were paying attention in history at all and you covered this kind of stuff, you know that Octavian and Mark Antony were kind of the big guys in the Roman world, and they were like the rulers of it. But then there was a disagreement between these two, and King Herod had to pick which one of these two he was going to follow. He couldn't pick, and he chose poorly. He chose Mark Antony. If you know the story, you know that didn't really work out well for him. And so Octavian becomes into power, and there's this feud between the two of them, and part of it had to do with the fact that Mark Antony married Octavian's sister, but wasn't like anywhere near his sister and was all about Cleopatra, and long story there. And so King Herod's in a situation where Octavian's now the one in control, and he's got a couple options. He can just kill himself and take care of the problem so that Octavian doesn't have to worry about it, save him the trouble. He can try to run away, or he comes up with a brilliant plan. And the thing you need to know about Herod is he was brilliant. He was smart. He was diplomatic. And so he wasn't going to let his pride get in the way of his ambition, which was his pride. He wasn't going to let his pride get in the way of his pride. You ever done this before? Anyway, so King Herod does something that's brilliant. It's smart, and this is why the guy was a ruler his entire life. He goes to Octavian, and he humbles himself before him, and he pledges his loyalty to him, and he says, I will be as loyal as I can be. You're my new guy. I am Negan. Like half of you probably know what I'm talking about. But anyway, he's like, I am going to be a part of that. And so he pledges his allegiance to Octavian, and Octavian is so impressed that he decides to make King Herod, not only to continue him as a ruler, but to go on with that and to give him even more expanded authority. So he was ambitious, he was smart, he was shrewd, and King Herod was put in this position. Now, you need to know about King Herod. He was not a Jew, but he was the king of the Jews. That was his role. He was put there as a client king by Rome, and he's like, we don't want a Jew in power because we don't want you to like get all excited about your people. We actually are going to put a king in place that's going to oppress and keep them in order, in line, so they'll pay their taxes and everything. So that was King Herod's role. He was the client king of Judea, or of the Jews. Now, he was so ambitious, and this was just such a brutal time. You forget about, like, our culture is so much different than the world they lived in. But he was so ambitious that every once in a while he would put one of his kids in power, one of his children, and he would like plan his succession plan, but then he would like not like that at all, and so then he would kill one of his kids and put another one in there, and then he'd put another one in there, and pretty soon his kids were like, no thanks, Dad, don't really want to be in authority or be a king or anything like that. He was ambitious, he was smart, and he was horrible. Now, here's where we pick up the story. Matthew mentions King Herod in the Christmas story. And again, the reason I like King Herod is because I think there's a little King Herod inside of all of us. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, Herod's turf, during the time of King Herod, Magi, or what we sometimes call wise men, from the east. And by the way, I think they are the most fascinating part. I love that there's some mystery there. Like, what are these guys and where did they come from? And I'm actually going to talk about them tomorrow night at the Christmas Eve service, so I'm going to kind of save that for them. But these wise men, these Magi from the east, came to Jerusalem and they asked King Herod, where is the one who has been born king of the Jews? Now, this could be a comedy, right? Because Herod has spent his whole life trying to establish his authority, his dominance. I'm the king of the Jews, and I'll kill anybody that says any different, right? He is white-knuckling this thing to try to gain control and be this guy, and he's made a lot of sacrifices to do it. And he's got everything in order, and then these yahoos from the east show up, and they're like, where's the king of the Jews? I mean, if he was drinking something, he was like, What do you mean the king of the Jews? I'm the king of the Jews, right? They said, where is he that is born king of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. And at this point, we don't think that Herod probably knew anything. And he's just like, star? King of the Jews? What are you talking about? When Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. And as I've said, what we know about King Herod, you can understand why all of Jerusalem was disturbed, because heads are going to roll when he is upset. When he had called together all of the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, so again, he's not Jewish, but he's like, okay, guys, what the heck are these people from the east talking about? Like, who's this king of the Jews? What are they talking about? Chief priests and teachers of the law. He asked them, where is the Messiah, the one that's been prophesied about, the one that's been foretold in your scriptures? Tell me more about this. Where is he supposed to be born? And they answered, everybody knows this, in Bethlehem. Like, if you have ever come across a Bible or sat in a synagogue at any point, went to the temple, these guys are like, well, Bethlehem, everybody knows that's the city of David. That's where the Messiah is supposed to be. In Bethlehem in Judea, your home turf. In fact, Bethlehem was just 5 miles away from Herod. This is his backyard. In his backyard, the light of the world was born. They replied, for this is what the prophet wrote. And then he quotes the Old Testament. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel. They're like, man, we've been waiting for him. He's going to come in Bethlehem. But they don't know what's coming. So they're like, why do you ask? Right? They don't even know what's going on. So Herod hears all this information. And he says, then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report him to me so that I too may go and worship him. Now, Herod's got some options at this point. And there's only a couple options that make sense. One, he can deny it and he can say, well, this is stupid. This small Jewish people, Rome's big, they're little, nothing good can come from them. These crazy guys from the east, right? Just a bunch of rich guys with time on their hands, okay? They show up and he could have just gone, this is nuts. And then the natural conclusion with it is, if it's nuts, nothing's going to come of it, right? So just go back to bed, right? Go about doing whatever it is that you go kill one of your kids or whatever it is that you've got on the agenda today. Forget about it because it's not real, right? The other option is to go, wow, prophecies over like 1,500, 2,000 years coming to fulfillment. And then all of a sudden these guys from the east who aren't even Jewish, they show up and they say that there's like a star. What would your reaction to be? I'd be like, point it out. Like, show me the star. Like, let's go find this thing. And then he could go, man, this is true. And if this is true, then this is like the God of the Jews is real, and I should probably step back and just let whatever happens going to happen because I might be powerful, but I can't take on God. That should be his reaction. But the third option is what he chose. He chose to believe the validity of the prophecy and of what they were saying, and he was like, I don't like that. And so he was so fixated, so ambitious, and so focused that he decided, I'm going to go pretend to worship him, and when I find out where this kid is, I'm going to kill him. And he was so focused on who he was, what he wanted to accomplish. He had his life mapped out, and this toddler king was not a part of the plan. After they had heard the king, they went on their way. And the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. That's pretty impressive. You got to understand, and I'll talk about this more tomorrow, these astrologers, these guys that are looking up the skies, like stars don't move. And then they don't stop for no reason. This is a big deal. And they come to this place, and it finally stopped, and their search is over. And it says, when they saw this, when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. Like, oh man, this is it. It is Bethlehem. The star ended up here, and the prophecy foretold that he would be here. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped. And they just, having no understanding at all, are like, well, this has to be It has to be real. It has to be true. And then, after having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they return to their own country by another route. So they sneak away. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said. "Take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." God's already way ahead of Herod. Herod's got this plan, and he's fixated on this plan, and he's willing to do whatever he can do, and God's way ahead of him. So, this is what Joseph did. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. Again, just imagine this guy like just stressing out, spitting drinks out of his mouth. Like he's like, "I can't believe this happened." And when Herod's furious, and there's no accountability for this, this is what happened. And he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. And then that's what he did. And soldiers went into this area around Bethlehem, and they went in from house to house, right? There's no Google report on this. They just have to go from house to house. They go in and they try to identify children that look like they're about this age, and then in front of the family, they take them outside and they kill them. And the family's left screaming, and they go to the next house, and they just do this over and over and over again until every child under the age of 2 is dead because Herod cannot even begin to think of not being in control of his own destiny. This is the place he's at. And then Joseph and Mary escape, and remember, Mary lived the rest of her life with knowledge of that had happened, that her child escaped, but that all these other children, all these other people that she probably even knew, some of them, had died because of her child. And she lived that way. Now that's who Herod is. And that kind of brings us to me and you. Now, I know you've never ordered people to be killed. Probably. I'm not sure. Maybe I shouldn't say that. This is like Detroit, okay? But probably you haven't ordered anybody to be killed. And the chances of you really connecting the story, but the thing's the same. Like, we still have this plan, we still have this will, this desire, and our ambition, especially the guys. I think I'm really talking to the guys in here. Guys, we get our plan, we get our ambition, we get our life focused. And we aren't going to let anybody or anything detour us from that. And Herod's he's just being king. He's at the top of his game. Things are going his direction. And then this toddler king shows up, and he's like, "I'm not going to let that stand in my way." And you and I get in a place the same way, and we interact, and when we come across the light of the world, the hope of humanity, the Son of God in flesh, our reaction is many times like Herod, to go, "Please. I'm not going to let this childish story," or that's what we hear in our head, "I'm not going to let this trip me up. I've got a plan. I'm headed in a direction. I'm going to be who I'm going to be." And we harden our heart. We put God on the back burner. We say, "It's not like I don't believe in God. It's just not important to me right now because I don't want it to mess up what's going on." And Herod was so committed to his ambition and so committed to the things that he wanted and desired in life that he allowed himself to miss the hope of the world that was just 5 miles down the road from him. He had an opportunity to be an early adopter. He had an opportunity to be one of the first people to go, "Wow, this is a miracle, and in my lifetime, I get to be a part of the miracle." But he chose the other option. Then it says this, the story continues on. After Herod died, Herod's death was terrible. Herod actually got a kidney disease, or what we think is a kidney disease now, looking back. And it was a horrible, painful kidney disease to the point where he wanted to die. And in fact, he was getting ready to kill himself, which back then, that was a nasty proposition. But he was getting ready to kill himself with a knife. And somebody walked in the door and stopped him. And so he decided not to commit suicide, but then he spent the rest of his life in pain and agony and miserable. And nobody liked him. But he was powerful and he was in control, but nobody liked him. So on the day he died, he rounded up a bunch of people, or right before he died, he rounded up a bunch of aristocrats and a bunch of prominent people in the area and their families. He had them imprisoned, and he said, when I die, I want you to kill them so that there will be mourning on the day of my death. He didn't want anybody to be happy on the day he died. What a nutcase, right? But that's what he did. He made that decision, and he put them all in these prisons, and then he died, and his kids let them all go. And they didn't do it. They were set free. Merry Christmas, you right? So after Herod died, this horrible, long, terrible life, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, get up. Again, he says, get up. Take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who were trying to take the child's life are dead. And so he goes back home, and Jesus is raised in Judea. And here's the really cool part of the story. 80 years later, so Jesus grows up to a man. He is crucified in the early 30s AD. Rose from the dead. The message is given out to everybody, and they go around and preach the gospel everywhere, and this new movement becomes, and the light shines brightly, and people all over are making a decision to follow this. And then John, this 80 years later, is looking back, and he is writing his gospel. And as we learned the last couple of weeks, in John chapter 1, he writes this down, looking back, thinking about all the different people that the light interacted with and who Jesus interacted with. And he says this, in him, talking about Jesus, was life. And that life was the light of all mankind. And then he said, thinking about people like Herod, people like Pilate, people like Caiaphas, people all throughout that Jesus interacted with, and the people they interacted with as they spread the gospel. He says the light shines in the darkness. Herod is the epitome of the darkness. He tried to put out the light, but then John writes this with just triumphant resound. He says, and the darkness has not overcome it. And it has never overcome it, and it will never overcome it. And people like Herod come and go, and they're convinced that they can put out the light, and they can disregard, and they've got their ambition, and they've got their plan, but the light can't be put out. And Herod goes down in the history books as somebody that interacted with the light and yet chose to reject it. He chose to put it off. Now, again, let me come back to you. I believe, and you may not believe this right now, but I believe this right now, and I would hate to not share this with you. I believe the only thing that matters about your life is the interaction that you have with the light. When it comes down to it, whether you were ambitious, whether you were successful, whether you accomplished all of your dreams or not, at the end of the day, the only thing that's going to matter about you is what was your reaction when you encountered the light of life? Because you're not going to put it out, and it's never going to be put out. What was your reaction? I've been thinking this past week about people in my life that I saw Herod-like, people that rejected the light of life their entire life. And the people that are closest to me are actually my grandparents on my mom's side. So they were out-of-towners, and they would come into town every once in a while, and we called them Granddad and Grandma Winnie. And they were fascinating people to me because I didn't know anybody like them. They would come into town. They were already retired when I was a young man, so they come into town somewhat frequently. Come into town. We didn't even live in a town. We lived on a farm, but they would come to the farm, and they would come in the house, and I would just sit there and watch them because they were fascinating people to me. They were cutting. For some reason, my dad hated it when they would show up. He never explained why that was till I was older, but he was like, oh my gosh, they're coming over, which I thought was weird because they gave me gifts and money, and I was okay with them, right? But he hated it every time they would show up. And it wasn't until I was older I realized why. But they would come over and they would say these really sharp things. Sometimes they were funny, but most of the time they were just really sharp. Say them to dad, say them to mom. When I was older, say them to me. Sometimes I would answer the phone when I was at home, and it would be Granddad, and Granddad would be just saying the weirdest stuff on the phone, and he always made sure that he talked about like how fat I was, and like he got that into every conversation, and he would say these just really sharp things, and I'd say, okay, bye, Granddad. Hang up the phone. Later, I found out it was because he was drunk. Like, I didn't realize he was like an alcoholic, and both of them were alcoholics. And then I'd just run off and eat some donuts or whatever. And then he was always like insulting, and he would make my brother promises, like my brother's going into farming and stuff, and he made him promises about how he's going to help him and support him, and then just completely forget that he ever said that. Anything. I would watch my grandma Winnie. One of the most fascinating things when they came over when I was a kid, I would just sit and watch her smoke because they were both chain smokers, and she would sit and smoke, and it was just nothing like it. She had this big old red lipstick on, and she was a big girl, and she would say something just crazy rude, and then she would take a drag and took up half the cigarette, and then she'd take a bite of her toast and a sip of a coffee, and I would just wait for the smoke to come back out, and it never did. I was like, that's a part of you now. That just went away, you know? And they were just fascinating people. And the older I got, I realized, oh man, and this is, not to skip ahead too much, but this is how my dad really felt about it. On the day my granddad died, we all got in the car after the funeral. I actually did the funeral. We get in the car. I'm sitting there with my dad, my brother, and my mom still out there. And I was like, well, that went pretty good. And Dad was like, yeah, it went better than I thought it would. I always threatened to pee on his grave when he died, but I didn't, so that's a win. But here's the thing, they rejected it over. My mom would like invite him to church, and she would say all these nice things, send them sweet cards. She was always so loving to them when they were just always so awful. And she would do this, and then finally one day, my grandma Winnie, she got really sick. She was basically on her deathbed, and my mom and her sister are trying to like share Christ with her, like, you know, what's going to happen after you die? Do you know what's going to happen? How do you feel about, have you made peace with God? And they're trying to share with her this understanding, and my grandma Winnie basically cursed Jesus' name, and then she had a stroke and couldn't talk for 7 days. Now, my mom, I wasn't there. My mom says she has some sense of peace, that like there was something that happened in that time period, and I want to give her the benefit of the doubt. But from my perspective, Grandma Winnie was King Herod. She just fervently rejected the light her entire life. Now, about a few months later, my granddad, I heard this news. I didn't really believe it at first. My granddad started going to church every week in this small town in Broken Bow, Nebraska. Started going to church every week. And a few months later, he was baptized. And a few months after that, like he was a completely different person. And I actually got to see him one last time. And I drove by his house on the way back to school. And I drove by his house and I stopped in to see him. And he was just not the same guy. He was free, and he was light, and he was filled with joy, and he was still a chain smoker. He still had some of the same characteristics, but he was new. And he got to this point where he was apologizing for the person he'd been or the grandpa he'd been to me, and he got out his checkbook to like pay for all that. And I was like, okay, how much is that? Yeah, go ahead. Let's how much would that be worth? Let me think. No, I just humbly sat there and waited as he wrote a check with tears trying to pay back some of the things that he had said and he had done. And then just a few months after that, he died. Right? And that's why my dad didn't pee on his grave. And it was an amazing thing. Like all of his life, everything horrible that he did, every time he hardened his heart, every time he rejected my mom's love, every time he said, I'm not gonna follow after God, and it was just childish and he wanted to do away with it. All of that was gone, and now the only thing that is remembered about him and will be remembered for eternity is that he finally saw the light. He finally chose the light. And it doesn't matter everything that he did in his life. He was washed, he was made new, and he is in eternity with his Father in heaven. And I just want to encourage you today, what's going to go down in history for you is not what you accomplish. Nobody at any funeral ever has walked up to anybody at their dad's funeral and said, so what did he accomplish in life? Let's write all that down. How much money did he make? How many cars did he own? What did he accomplish? No. People don't talk about that at all. At the end of the day, the only thing that matters in anybody's life is when you saw the light, what did you do? Let me pray for you. God, I pray that every person that's here today would step into the light, that they would re-engage, that they would put all of their heart and life into knowing you, that they wouldn't pass by it or disregard it like Herod, God, but that they would let your hope and your truth and your light transform them. God, I pray that every person that gathers here and is listening and watching online, God, I pray that a burden would fall off of their shoulders as they step into the light, as they are known by you, as they acknowledge what they've done and who they are. And God, I pray that you would wash them clean and pure. I pray that you would make them new through your light. And I pray that in Christ's name. Amen.